The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with an artificial drone that seemed to mock the gravity of the moment. The courtroom was a cathedral of cold marble and oak, designed to intimidate, to remind everyone who entered that justice was serious business. 8-year-old Sophie Martinez sat rigidly beside her mother in the gallery section, her small feet dangling above the floor in white sneakers that her father had bought her last Christmas, back when he still smiled at family dinners. She wore a navy blue dress that her mother had carefully selected, something that wouldn't draw attention, something that would make her look innocent and vulnerable. Sophie understood, even at her young age, that appearance mattered in this place. Everything was about perception. Judge Harold Richardson occupied the bench with the gravity of someone who had seen countless lives destroyed by acrimony and betrayal. He was a large man with silver hair and reading glasses that hung on a chain around his neck. His face was deeply lined, mapped with the territories of difficult decisions he'd made over 3 decades of judicial service. The judge had presided over more than 200 custody cases, and he developed an almost supernatural ability to detect lies. Yet something about this particular case bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Perhaps it was the viciousness between the two parents. Perhaps it was the obvious suffering of the child caught between them. Michael Martinez stood abruptly, his face flushed crimson with barely contained rage. He was a handsome man in his late 30s, with dark hair graying at the temples and the build of someone who used the gym to process his emotions. His voice, when he spoke, trembled with fury as he gestured wildly at his estranged wife. The words he hurled across the courtroom were vicious accusations, that she was manipulating Sophie, that she was an unfit mother, that she'd deliberately poisoned their daughter against him. His attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named, tugged gently at his sleeve, trying to get him to sit down before the judge held him in contempt. Sat perfectly still, her face a mask of controlled devastation. She was an attractive woman in her early 40s, with the kind of beauty that came from inner strength rather than makeup or fashion. Her hands were folded precisely in her lap. Her eyes were fixed forward. She had learned through 12 months of this legal nightmare that any reaction would be weaponized against her. Any tear would be called manipulation. Any anger would be labeled instability. So she sat in silence, absorbing the accusations like a woman made of stone, all while her heart shattered into smaller and smaller pieces. Sophie flinched with each of her father's outbursts. She didn't understand the legal arguments or the specific accusations being made. What she understood was that her parents hated each other, and somehow, inexplicably, this hatred had become about her. She was the reason the judge was here. She was the reason her father's face turned that frightening shade of red. She was the reason her mother's jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might break. Judge Richardson banged his gavel 3 times, the sound reverberating through the chamber like thunder. "Order," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Michael immediately fell silent and sat down, but not before casting one more venomous glance at his wife. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture that revealed his exhaustion. "We will take a 15-minute recess," he announced. "Counsel, I expect both of you to control your client's outbursts, or we will be discussing contempt of court charges." Sophie's therapist, Dr. Williams, had warned her mother that the stress of the custody battle was causing severe psychological damage to the child. During their last session, Sophie had described feeling like she was being torn in two, as if each parent was pulling at a different arm, and she was terrified of breaking. She'd confessed to having nightmares, to experiencing panic attacks so severe that her body would freeze completely and she couldn't breathe. She'd admitted to throwing up that morning before coming to court, twice, actually. The second time, she'd hidden it from her mother because she didn't want to cause any additional stress. Sophie clutched a tissue in her small hands, twisting it into smaller and smaller pieces until it resembled confetti. The tissue was falling apart, just like everything else in her life. She thought about her old house, the one where she'd lived before the divorce was finalized. She remembered her parents laughing together in the kitchen while her mother cooked her father's favorite pasta. She remembered her father pushing her on the swing in the backyard, both of them laughing so hard they could barely breathe. That felt like another lifetime, like memories from a different girl entirely. Around her, other court observers watched with varying degrees of interest. Some were social workers, mandated to attend custody hearings. Some were law students, watching a real case unfold. Some were simply people interested in the drama of human suffering. Sophie didn't know that several people in that courtroom were already making notes about her for their records, documenting her distress for later evaluation. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, thick enough that you could almost touch it. It seemed to emanate from every corner, seeping into the breathing space between people. Michael stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly that Sophie could see the muscles working beneath the skin of his face, kept her eyes closed as if she were praying, though Sophie had never seen her mother pray before. The attorneys whispered urgently to each other, their voices inaudible but their body language aggressive. Sophie's mind raced with questions she was afraid to ask and fears she couldn't articulate. Would she have to testify? Would she be forced to choose between her parents in front of all these strangers? If she sided with her mother, would her father hate her? If she sided with her father, would she be betraying her mother's trust? Was this her fault somehow? Had she done something wrong in her previous life that made the universe punish her this way? She looked up at her mother, searching for reassurance, for some signal that everything would be okay. But's face was blank, carefully constructed to show nothing. Sophie understood, without being told explicitly, that her mother was using all her emotional energy just to hold herself together. There was nothing left over for comfort or reassurance. The realization that her mother was just as broken and helpless as she was made Sophie's chest feel even. Judge Richardson returned from his chambers, his expression grim. As he settled into his seat, he glanced toward Sophie, and for just a moment their eyes met. The judge saw a terrified child drowning in circumstances beyond her control. He saw suffering that no 8-year-old should ever experience. He saw innocence being destroyed by the selfishness of adults. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a recognition that this case was about far more than legal custody arrangements. This was about a child's survival. "We will resume with final testimonies," Judge Richardson announced, his voice quieter than before, carrying an unexpected gentleness. "Sophie Martinez, will you please approach the stand?" Sophie's world tilted. This was happening. This was really happening. She looked toward her mother, who nodded encouragement. She looked toward her father, who gave her a look she couldn't quite read. Was it anger, desperation, fear, all of the above? As Sophie stood on shaky legs and began walking toward the witness stand, she didn't know that everything was about to change. She didn't know that this moment would become the turning point of her life. She didn't know that she was about to discover a strength she didn't know she possessed, or that help would come from an unexpected source. She only knew that her heart was breaking, and she was utterly alone. 3 weeks before that fateful courtroom appearance, life had taken an unexpected turn that would eventually become the lifeline Sophie desperately needed. Her grandmother, Martinez, had been struggling with her own grief over the dissolution of her son's marriage. She watched her granddaughter deteriorate week by week, becoming smaller somehow, as if the weight of the custody battle was physically shrinking her. Was a woman in her 70s who had survived her own share of heartbreak. She'd lost her husband to cancer 15 years ago, and she understood the terrain of deep, inescapable pain. One Tuesday afternoon, while running errands near the city's animal rescue sanctuary, found herself drawn inside. She wasn't sure why. She'd never been particularly drawn to animals, had never owned a dog or kept anything more demanding than a houseplant. But something compelled her through those doors. Perhaps it was divine intervention, perhaps it was pure chance. The sanctuary was a sprawling facility nestled on the outskirts of the city, filled with rescued animals that had been given a second chance at life. The smell of hay and animal feed permeated the air, mixing with the sound of various creatures going about their day. The director, A warm woman named who moved with the easy confidence of someone who truly understood animals, gave a tour. They passed several dogs in various states of rehabilitation, some recovering from abuse, some adjusting to life after abandonment, some simply waiting for families who might never come. And then they entered a section that called the Second Chance Ward, a place dedicated to animals that had been written off as unadoptable by other facilities. That's where saw him. Leo was a golden retriever, approximately 2 years old, with a coat that gleamed like spun copper in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. But it was his eyes that captured Sa's attention. They were the saddest eyes she'd ever seen in an animal. His story, explained, was heartbreaking. Leo had been rescued from a home where he'd been kept in a basement for the first year and a half of his life. His owners had bred him accidentally and didn't want to deal with the litter, so they'd simply locked him away in darkness. He'd been severely malnourished, his bones visible through his fur. He'd been found when neighbors reported suspicious sounds to animal control. Despite his traumatic beginning, Leo had remarkable temperament, had worked with a specialist organization that trained emotional support animals, and Leo had shown unusual aptitude for the work. He could sense human emotional distress with almost supernatural accuracy. He understood when to provide comfort and when to simply remain present. He was, in words, born to help people who were broken. But Leo had never been adopted. Most families wanted a confident, happy dog, not one that seemed to carry the weight of his own tragedy. Most people couldn't handle a dog that reminded them of their own pain. Found herself kneeling beside Leo and something profound happened. The dog approached her slowly, cautiously, as if understanding that she, too, was carrying invisible wounds. He didn't jump or bark or demand attention the way most dogs did. Instead, he simply rested his head on her lap, his weight pressing gently against her legs, felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the knot of tension she'd been carrying for months. She stroked his copper-colored fur, and tears began to fall down her face without her permission or understanding. "I think he's found his person," said softly, understanding what was happening without needing explanation. Left the sanctuary that day with Leo on a leash she'd just purchased, and she drove directly to his house. When opened the door and saw her mother-in-law standing there with this beautiful, sad-eyed dog, her first reaction was confusion, then resistance. How could she care for a dog when everything in her life was falling apart? How could she take on additional responsibility when she was barely functioning? But then Sophie came to the door, and everything changed. Sophie's eyes, which had been hollow and distant for months, suddenly widened with surprise and wonder. In that single moment, something ancient and primal stirred to life inside the child. She dropped to her knees, and Leo approached her with the same careful deliberation he'd shown. This time, however, something different happened. The dog pressed his entire body against Sophie's chest, as if trying to merge with her, to absorb her pain and take it into himself. Sophie buried her face in Leo's fur and wept, not the controlled, quiet tears she'd learned to produce, but deep, cleansing sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being. She wept for the broken family, for the childhood she'd lost, for the impossible position she'd been placed in. And Leo simply held her, his body a shield against the cruelty of the world. Over the following weeks, something magical and undeniable began to unfold. Sophie and Leo became inseparable. In the morning before school, Leo would wait by Sophie's bedroom door. During homework, Leo would rest his head on her knee, his presence grounding her in the present moment. At night, when Sophie had nightmares about the courtroom and her father's angry face, Leo would wake before she did, nuzzling her face until she emerged from the nightmare back into reality. But more significantly, and noticed that Sophie had developed an almost supernatural connection with Leo. The dog seemed to understand Sophie's emotional state better than any therapist or family member could. When Sophie's anxiety began to build, those first subtle signs before a full panic attack, Leo would know. He would position himself between Sophie and whatever was threatening her. He would lean against her legs with steady, reassuring pressure. He would place his head on her lap and refuse to move until the anxiety passed. Sophie, for her part, began to communicate with Leo in a language that existed beyond words. She whispered her deepest fears to him during those quiet moments before sleep. She told him about the things her father had said that made her feel guilty for loving her mother. She told him about the things her mother's lawyer had instructed her to say, and how those instructions made her feel like a traitor. She told him about her terror of the upcoming courtroom testimony. Leo listened to every word, his eyes reflecting a compassion that seemed far beyond what an animal should possess. One afternoon, about 2 weeks before the scheduled court date, something extraordinary happened. Sophie and Leo were sitting in the backyard, and Sophie was in the midst of an anxiety spiral, her breathing shallow, her hands shaking, her mind racing with catastrophic thoughts about what would happen in court. Watched from the kitchen window, helpless to stop her daughter's suffering. Then Sophie made a small gesture with her left hand, almost unconscious, a subtle movement that might have been dismissed as nothing. Leo's entire body straightened. He moved directly to Sophie, pressed his full weight against her, and began breathing deeply and deliberately as if teaching Sophie how to breathe. Sophie mimicked his breathing pattern, syncing her inhalations and exhalations with his. Within minutes, her anxiety had transformed. Her breathing normalized. Her hands stopped shaking. The panic released its grip on her body. Realized she was witnessing something profound. Sophie and Leo had developed a nonverbal communication system, a way of understanding each other that transcended the limitations of human language. It was a signal, Leo's alert, Sophie's gentle gesture, and his response was consistent, reliable, and devastatingly effective. And exchanged glances over the following days. They began documenting these interactions, taking notes about when Sophie would make the gesture and how Leo would respond. They realized that this wasn't random behavior or simple training. This was genuine partnership between a child and an animal who understood each other on a fundamental level. As the court date approached and Sophie's anxiety intensified, Leo became her anchor to reality. He was the one constant in a world of chaos. He was the one being in her life who asked nothing of her except her presence. He loved her unconditionally, without judgment, without manipulation, without conditions. In a life that had become fundamentally about choosing sides and performing emotional loyalty, Leo offered something revolutionary: acceptance. Made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She decided that Leo would come to court, not as a distraction or a comfort object, but as a witness to the truth about her daughter's emotional state. If the court system wanted to understand Sophie's suffering, if the judge wanted to know the reality of what this custody battle had done to an innocent child, then Leo's presence would speak volumes that no attorney could articulate. Tucked Leo into the back of the car on the morning of the hearing, her old hand stroking his ears gently. "This is your job," she whispered to the dog. "This is what you were saved for. This is why you survived that terrible beginning. You're going to save her today." Leo's ears perked up, and his soulful eyes seemed to understand the weight of the moment. He rested his head on the car seat, waiting for whatever would come next, ready to be the voice for a child who couldn't speak. The morning of the final hearing arrived with the weight of finality that made every breath feel heavier than it should. Sophie woke at 5 o'clock, her body thrumming with anxiety that had manifested during sleep. She dreamed of falling, plummeting through darkness toward an unknown ground. Her heart was racing, her pajamas damp with perspiration. Leo was already awake, positioned against her side, his warm body providing grounding in the pre-dawn darkness. She pressed her face against his fur and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Knocked gently on Sophie's door, carrying clothes her daughter had worn to church on Easter, navy blue, modest, designed to evoke innocence and vulnerability. The attorney had specifically requested that Sophie wear something that would elicit sympathy from Judge Richardson. Everything about this day was calculated, performed, constructed to create a specific impression. Sophie hated it. She hated the manipulation embedded in every detail, hated that even her clothing was a weapon in this war between her parents. In the kitchen, prepared Sophie's favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with maple syrup, but Sophie could only manage a few bites. Her stomach was twisted into knots so tight she wondered if she might actually vomit right there at the table. Didn't push. She simply sat beside her daughter and stroked her hair, a gesture that was both comforting and heartbreaking in its inadequacy. "Leo is going to be there," said softly, breaking the promise she'd made to the court that she wouldn't inform Sophie of this controversial decision. "Not in the courtroom, but close by, in the hallway. You'll know he's there." Sophie looked up at her mother, searching her face for honesty. "Is that allowed?" "Probably not," admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes we have to do what's right, not what's allowed. You know that, don't you? You know the difference." Sophie understood what her mother was really asking. Was she ready to be brave? Was she ready to step into that courtroom and tell the truth, even knowing that her father would be angry, even knowing that his anger might mean consequences she couldn't predict or control? Sophie nodded, though fear was pooling in her belly like flood water. The drive to the courthouse was silent except for the sound of traffic and the occasional whine of Leo from the back seat. Sat in the front passenger seat, her weathered hands gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. She kept glancing in the mirror at her granddaughter, who stared out the window with the blank expression of someone who had dissociated from her own body. This was a coping mechanism Sophie had developed, the ability to step outside herself and observe events from a distance, as if they were happening to someone else. The courthouse loomed before them like a concrete castle designed to intimidate. Its marble steps seemed to stretch infinitely upward. Its columns suggested permanence and authority. It was a building designed to make individuals feel small and powerless. Sophie felt every bit of that smallness as she climbed the steps, her hand in her mother's grip, her eyes fixed on her feet. Leo was left within a waiting room designated for family members. Sophie felt the separation like a physical tearing. She reached back toward where Leo waited but gently redirected her forward. "He's right there," whispered. "Not far. You can do this." The courtroom itself was colder than Sophie remembered, more imposing. The morning session had already begun with various procedural matters that meant nothing to Sophie. She sat beside her mother's attorney, a woman who had been kind but also terrifyingly competent in her quest to protect custody rights. Patted Sophie's hand reassuringly, but Sophie could feel the tension radiating from the attorney. Everyone understood that Sophie's testimony was the linchpin of the entire case. Judge Richardson sat elevated on his bench, his gray eyes scanning the courtroom with the deliberation of someone accustomed to parsing truth from deception. He'd already heard hours of testimony from both parents, various therapists, teachers, and neighbors. Now came the moment that would likely determine the outcome, the child's own voice. Michael's attorney was a different breed altogether. He was a tall man with slick-back hair and a reputation for aggressive cross-examination. He specialized in child custody cases, and he had a specific methodology: find the child's vulnerabilities and exploit them relentlessly. Believed that children could be manipulated into saying anything if you asked the right questions in the right sequence. He believed that Sophie's testimony could be dismantled, that her allegiance to her mother was manufactured, that she was being used as a pawn in his campaign to alienate her from her father. The oath was administered. Sophie's hand touched the Bible and she swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. The words felt too adult, too grave for someone her size. She settled into the witness stand, which seemed designed for people much larger than she was. Her feet dangled. Her hands gripped the wooden edges of the stand. She tried to make herself small, invisible, as if she could disappear entirely. Began gently, asking Sophie basic questions about her life, her school, her friends, her interests. These were softball questions, designed to help Sophie settle her nerves and establish a baseline of confidence. Sophie answered in quiet tones, her voice barely carrying across the courtroom. Judge Richardson leaned forward to hear her more clearly, then stood. His movement was theatrical, performed for an audience. He approached the witness stand with the casual confidence of a predator who had already targeted his prey. Sophie's hands began to shake immediately. She recognized the energy shift in the room. This was not going to be gentle. "Sophie," began, his voice smooth as oil, "your mother's attorney has been coaching you about what to say today, hasn't she?" "No," Sophie said quietly. "Are you sure? Because children often tell people what they think those people want to hear, don't they? That's a normal thing kids do." Objected, and Judge Richardson sustained it, but had already planted the seed of doubt. He continued, his questions becoming increasingly pointed, increasingly designed to confuse and upset Sophie. He suggested that Sophie loved her father just as much as her mother. Wouldn't she say that was true? He suggested that Sophie had fabricated stories about her father's behavior because her mother had encouraged her to do so. He suggested that had poisoned Sophie against her father out of spite and revenge. Each question was a small cut, and each cut bled into the next. Sophie's anxiety began to build incrementally. Her hands trembled. Her breathing became shallow, pressed harder, his voice taking on a more aggressive edge. "Isn't it true, Sophie, that you're just trying to hurt your father because you're angry about the divorce? Isn't it true that you don't really want to see him, and you're blaming him for things he didn't actually do?" Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The anxiety was tightening around her chest like a python. Her vision began to tunnel. Her hands felt numb and distant, as if they belonged to someone else. The courtroom seemed to stretch and contract around her. His face loomed closer, his expression one of calculated menace. "Answer the question, Sophie. You do understand English, don't you?" Sophie couldn't speak. The panic attack was descending now, that familiar crushing weight that made it impossible to breathe, impossible to think, impossible to function. Her father was watching her from his seat, and his expression was one of cold fury. Judge Richardson was watching with growing concern. The courtroom observers were scribbling notes, and Sophie was drowning. She was utterly alone in that moment, completely abandoned by every adult supposedly there to protect her. The only comfort existed in the hallway, separated from her by a wooden door and architectural space. Sophie's desperation became acute. Her body was betraying her. Her mind was fracturing. She needed Leo. She needed that unconditional presence. She needed the one being in the world who didn't have an agenda or an expectation or a demand. And in her desperation, without conscious thought or planning, Sophie's left hand rose. It moved with trembling precision. She made the gesture, subtle, almost invisible to most observers, the signal she'd practiced with Leo 100 times, the communication system they'd developed together. In that hallway, in that waiting room separated from the courtroom by a single door, Leo's ears perked up. His entire body straightened. Some force beyond ordinary understanding had transmitted across space and through barriers. Leo understood what Sophie needed. Leo understood that his person was in crisis. And Leo began to move. The hallway outside the courtroom was painted a sterile beige, the color of institutional passivity. Sat on a wooden bench beside Leo, occasionally stroking his ears while pretending to read a magazine she wasn't actually seeing. Leo had been calm for the past hour, resting his head on his paws, his amber eyes focused on the closed courtroom door. But something shifted in the air at precisely 10:47 in the morning. Felt it before she understood it, a subtle vibration of energy, an almost imperceptible change in Leo's demeanor. The dog's head lifted suddenly. His ears stood at attention, pointing toward the courtroom door like radar dishes detecting an invisible signal. His entire body went rigid, every muscle coiling with sudden purpose. Had learned over the past weeks to recognize this state. This was Leo's alert mode, the transformation that occurred when he sensed Sophie was in genuine distress. "Leo," whispered, understanding that something significant was happening. The dog stood, his legs braced as if preparing for action. His eyes remained locked on that door. knew what was about to happen because she'd seen it during their weeks together. Leo was about to respond to Sophie's silent call. His heart began to race. She hadn't explicitly discussed with what would happen if Leo needed to reach Sophie during the testimony, but both women understood the reality. If Sophie was truly in crisis, Leo would find a way to her. Did not stop him. Leo approached the courtroom door, a heavy wooden barrier with a small rectangular window at eye level for adults. The dog had no way to open it himself, but at that moment, a court officer named Thomas stepped into the hallway, having excused himself from proceedings to use the restroom. He held the door slightly ajar for just a moment, enough for Leo to slip through with the precision of an animal with singular focus and purpose. Inside the courtroom, silence had descended like a heavy blanket. Stood frozen, his mouth still open mid-sentence, having witnessed Sophie's complete emotional shutdown. Judge Richardson had straightened in his chair, his judicial instincts recognizing that something critical had occurred, was halfway to her feet, preparing to object to his aggressive line of questioning. His face was stricken with terror at her daughter's obvious distress. Sophie herself was lost in the depths of her panic attack. Her vision had narrowed to a pinpoint. Her hearing was muffled as if she were underwater. Her body was betraying her in every possible way. Her heart was racing so fast she thought it might explode. Her lungs refused to expand fully. Her limbs felt disconnected from her brain. She was aware of the courtroom, aware of the judge and the attorneys and the observers, but she was also completely disconnected from it all, as if experiencing everything through frosted glass. Then the courtroom door opened. Leo entered with the purposefulness of a missile locked onto its target. He didn't walk casually or with any hesitation. His movement was deliberate, his path straight, his intention crystal clear. He navigated the courtroom with the efficiency of someone, or in this case, some being, with absolute knowledge of where he needed to be and what he needed to do. His mouth fell open in genuine shock. He'd been cross-examining children for 15 years, and nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. Objection. Your Honor, there's a... Judge Richardson raised his hand, silencing without speaking. The judge's eyes had widened slightly, his entire judicial demeanor transforming into something more human, more engaged. He recognized that he was witnessing something extraordinary, something that transcended the normal parameters of courtroom procedure. Michael Martinez made a move as if to stand, but his attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm. Everyone in the courtroom had frozen, suspended in a moment that seemed to exist outside of normal time. Leo approached the witness stand without hesitation, navigating around the furniture and people with remarkable grace for such a large animal. He moved directly towards Sophie, who was still locked in the grip of her panic attack, still unable to speak or move or function. The dog placed his front paws on the edge of the witness stand, his back legs remaining on the courtroom floor, positioning himself directly in front of the small girl. For a moment nothing happened, then Sophie looked up. Her eyes, which had been unfocused and wild with terror, suddenly locked onto Leo's face. Recognition, connection, salvation. Sophie released a sound, something between a sob and a gasp, and threw her arms around the dog's neck. Her entire body collapsed forward, her face burying itself in his golden fur. The controlled, fragile composure she'd been maintaining shattered completely. She began to cry with a rawness and authenticity that no cross-examination, no legal argument, no attorney's skill could have extracted from her. But these were not tears of defeat. These were tears of release, of overwhelming relief, of finally being able to feel and express the devastation that had been locked inside her chest. She held Leo as if he were the only solid thing in an unstable universe, and he remained absolutely still, allowing her to grip him, allowing her to lean her weight against him, allowing her to borrow his strength. Leo's body language was extraordinary in its intentionality. He didn't move. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't try to comfort her in the way dogs typically did with kisses or licking or enthusiasm. Instead, he simply held the position, his body a fortress, his presence absolutely stable. He was being exactly what Sophie needed in this moment, an anchor, a shield, a witness to her truth. Judge Richardson had removed his glasses and was watching the scene unfold with an expression that transcended judicial neutrality. Had tears in her own eyes. Even some of the court observers were dabbing at their eyes with tissues. Sat perfectly still, her hand over her mouth, watching her daughter finally receive the support she so desperately needed. Attempted to regain control of the courtroom. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The witness is emotionally compromised and this animal is. Counsel, Judge Richardson said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. I suggest you sit down before I hold you in contempt. Sat down immediately, recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in the room's energy. The judge's eyes remained fixed on Sophie and Leo, watching the profound communication occurring between child and animal. No words were being spoken, yet every observer in that courtroom understood that they were witnessing truth in its most undeniable form. Judge Richardson leaned back in his chair, his weathered face contemplative. He'd presided over hundreds of custody cases, had listened to countless expert testimonies about parenting styles and emotional and child psychology, but nothing in any expert testimony had conveyed what he was seeing in this moment. A dog, a creature without agenda, without legal motivation, without the ability to lie, had responded to a child's silent distress with purposeful, protective intervention. The judge understood in that moment that the law was failing this child. The procedures designed to protect her were causing her additional harm. The adversarial system, which pitted parents against each other in contests of verbal sparring and legal maneuvering, was not serving her best interests. And Sophie's actual truth, expressed not through words forced from her under hostile questioning, but through the authentic emotional connection with an animal who loved her unconditionally, was more powerful than any testimony could ever be. 2 minutes passed, then 3. The courtroom remained in absolute silence. Judge Richardson did not move. No one objected. No one attempted to remove Leo or restore courtroom order. It seemed as if time itself had been suspended, as if the normal rules of judicial procedure had been temporarily suspended in the face of something larger and more important. Eventually, Sophie's crying softened. Her breathing began to regulate. Leo shifted his weight only slightly, adjusting to ensure her comfort. The two of them remained in their embrace, a girl and a dog communicating across the boundary between species, beyond the limitations of human language, speaking a truth that no judge, no attorney, no expert witness could deny. Judge Richardson finally spoke, his voice quiet and contemplative. I think we need to take a recess. Court is adjourned for the remainder of the day. I want comprehensive evaluations of this child's psychological state, her living situations with both parents, and a detailed assessment of this animal's training and qualifications. Counsel will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. He banged his gavel, not with anger or frustration, but with the deliberation of someone who had just understood that justice, true justice, required looking beyond legal procedure to genuine human. And as the courtroom slowly came back to life around them, Sophie and Leo remained exactly where they were, a child and her dog, speaking the language of survival and unconditional love. Judge Harold Richardson's chambers were a sanctuary of leather-bound books and mahogany furniture, a space that reflected 3 decades of judicial decision-making. Yet this sanctuary had never felt more chaotic than it did on that afternoon, when the judge summoned both legal teams for an emergency meeting. His expression was grim, his demeanor transformed from judicial neutrality into something more intensely personal and engaged. The judge didn't waste time on pleasantries. I want to understand what just happened in my courtroom, he began, his gray eyes fixed on Saturni. That dog appeared at precisely the moment this child reached a critical emotional crisis. I want to know if this was planned, orchestrated, or if it was something else entirely. face flushed slightly. She'd known that bringing Leo to court was a gamble, but she hadn't anticipated that the dog would actually enter the courtroom. That had been decision alone, made without consulting with her attorney, chose her words carefully. Your Honor, Leo is a certified emotional support animal. He's been working with Sophie for approximately 3 weeks. The connection between them is genuine and has been documented by multiple observers. However, I must be honest, his presence in the courtroom today was not orchestrated by the legal team. His entrance was unexpected. Judge Richardson's eyes narrowed, so the animal acted independently. Yes, Your Honor. Sophie made a gesture, a signal they've developed together, and Leo responded to it. It wasn't a trained courtroom behavior. It was a spontaneous response to genuine emotional distress. Michael's attorney, the aggressive, leaned forward. Your Honor, with respect, this entire situation is highly irregular. We can't allow a child's emotional state to be influenced by an animal in the courtroom. That's not justice. That's theater. Judge Richardson fixed with a look that silenced him immediately. What I witnessed today, counsel, was a child in acute psychological crisis being offered comfort by an animal that apparently understands her better than any adult in her life. Whether that's theater or not is precisely what we need to investigate. The judge stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Here's what's going to happen. I'm ordering a comprehensive psychological evaluation of Sophie to be conducted by Dr. No relation to your name, counsel, who is recognized as one of the foremost experts in child trauma and custody disputes. I'm also ordering independent evaluations of this animal's training and qualifications. And I want detailed background reports on both parents' homes, their parenting practices, and any incidents that might explain why this child is experiencing such severe psychological distress. He turned back to face the attorneys. Furthermore, I'm requesting surveillance footage and recorded visits between Sophie and both parents over the past 6 months. I want to understand what's actually happening in these interactions, not what either parent claims is happening. And I'm authorizing immediate home studies conducted by social services. Objected strenuously, claiming that the judge was exceeding his authority, that these measures were excessive and violated Michael's rights. Judge Richardson's response was swift and final. Your client's rights are noted. My priority, however, is the of an 8-year-old child who appeared to be in a state of psychological emergency today. If you find my procedures excessive, you're welcome to file an appeal with the appellate court. But those are my orders, and they will be followed. The meeting ended shortly thereafter, both attorneys aware that the judge had fundamentally shifted his approach to the case. Over the following 7 days, the investigation unfolded with surprising speed and devastating thoroughness. Doctor conducted 3 separate sessions with Sophie, each one revealing deeper layers of emotional trauma. She used play therapy, art therapy, and gentle questioning to help Sophie access memories and feelings she'd been suppressing. What emerged was a heartbreaking portrait of a child caught in the middle of parental warfare, manipulated by both sides, but more significantly harmed by her father's behavior. Sophie revealed that during visits with Michael, he would ask her detailed questions about her mother's personal life. Who was she spending time with? Was she dating anyone? Did she seem happy without him? These questions seemed innocent on the surface, but their underlying message was clear. Your mother abandoned us, and you should be loyal to me instead of her. Michael would also tell Sophie that her mother was making false allegations about him, that she was trying to turn Sophie against him out of spite. He would alternate between being intensely affectionate and then withdrawing his attention entirely, creating an emotional that left Sophie anxious and desperate to please him. During one session, Sophie confessed something she'd never told anyone. Her father had once told her that if she sided with her mother in the custody case, it meant she didn't love him anymore. He'd made her emotional loyalty conditional, forcing her into an impossible psychological bind. She couldn't speak truthfully about her experiences without feeling as though she was betraying her father. She couldn't express her actual feelings without risking his rejection. Doctor documented clear symptoms of anxiety disorder, complex trauma, and emotional manipulation. She noted that Sophie exhibited classic signs of parental alienation, not from a parent, but rather from her own authentic self. The child had learned to suppress her genuine feelings and express whatever she thought each parent wanted to hear. In stark contrast, doctors' observations of Sophie's interactions with revealed a mother genuinely attempting to support her daughter's emotional, even while navigating her own devastation about the marriage collapse, had sought professional help for Sophie without being ordered to do so. She'd attended parenting classes. She'd attended her own therapy sessions. She wasn't perfect. No parent was, but her actions consistently prioritized Sophie's mental health over winning the custody battle. The service animal assessment was equally illuminating. Leo's trainer, a specialist named David, that Leo's behavior in the courtroom was not unusual for a well-trained emotional support animal. What we witnessed, stated, was Leo responding to a genuine distress signal from someone he's bonded with. Sophie has been teaching Leo her own unique signals for anxiety management. When she made that gesture, Leo's response was exactly what he was trained to do: provide immediate emotional support and grounding. Went on to explain that Leo's presence had actually served a critical legal function, even if unintentionally. The dog is incapable of deception. He can't be manipulated by lawyers or coached by parents. His response to Sophie was authentic, and that authenticity speaks to the reality of her emotional state. The surveillance footage from custody exchanges revealed patterns that corroborated Sophie's testimony. Video showed Michael frequently speaking intensely to Sophie in ways that made her body language shift from relaxed to tense. Video showed attempting to be warm and welcoming while also maintaining appropriate boundaries. The visual record didn't lie. Home studies conducted by social services revealed that home was calm, organized, and child-centered. Sophie had her own room decorated with her input. The house was structured but not rigid. Social workers observed interacting with Sophie with genuine warmth and appropriate parental guidance. Michael's home, while materially comfortable and clean, had a different energy. Michael seemed constantly anxious about Sophie's approval, alternating between being overly accommodating and then expressing disappointment when Sophie didn't meet his expectations. He discussed adult topics with her: his own emotional pain, his anger toward, his sense of victimization in the divorce. He was his child, making her an emotional support system for his own needs. The most damaging evidence came from Sophie's school. The school counselor, Mrs. Williams, that Sophie's anxiety had significantly decreased in the weeks since Leo's arrival in her life. Before the dog, Mrs. Williams stated, Sophie was having panic attacks multiple times per week. She was withdrawn from her peers. She was struggling academically. Since Leo, we've seen a dramatic turnaround. She's more engaged, more social, more emotionally regulated. The pediatrician noted that Sophie had experienced recent weight loss and sleep disturbances that were consistent with anxiety disorder triggered by the custody battle. This child is being harmed by the prolonged legal process, the pediatrician stated bluntly. The stress is manifesting in her physical body. By the end of the investigation week, Judge Richardson had received a comprehensive portrait of the situation. Sophie wasn't lying. She wasn't being coached by her mother. She was a traumatized child who had been emotionally manipulated by her father, however unintentionally. Leo wasn't a distraction. He was a lifeline. Judge Richardson sat alone in his chambers late one evening, reading through the compiled reports. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the evidence. He thought about Sophie in the witness stand, completely overwhelmed, unable to advocate for herself. He thought about Leo entering the courtroom like an angel descending from heaven. He thought about his responsibility as a judge to protect not just legal processes but actual human beings, particularly vulnerable children. He made a decision that night, a decision that would transform not just this case, but potentially the entire judicial system's approach to family law cases involving children. Tomorrow's ruling would be unlike anything this courthouse had ever seen. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the morning that Judge Richardson would announce his findings. News had leaked about the unprecedented investigation, and legal scholars, journalists, and child advocacy professionals had descended on the courthouse, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation and tension. Even the courthouse staff seemed to understand that this hearing would be different, more consequential, than standard legal proceedings. Sophie sat between her mother and grandmother, Leo's head resting on her lap. The dog had been formally recognized as an emotional support animal with courtroom access, a decision that had already sent shockwaves through the legal community. Michael sat on the opposite side of the courtroom with his attorney, his face a mask of anxiety. He'd received preliminary reports about the investigation findings, and he knew they weren't favorable to his case. Judge Richardson entered with more deliberation than usual, moving slowly to his seat on the bench. He settled himself carefully, adjusting his glasses, taking a moment to look directly at Sophie. His expression conveyed both compassion and gravity. He then turned his attention to the gathering, addressing the entire courtroom with unusual solemnity. This case has presented circumstances that I believe warrant a comprehensive statement, Judge Richardson began, his voice carrying the weight of his conviction. The investigation into the psychological and emotional state of Sophie Martinez has revealed findings that are deeply troubling and impossible to ignore. He adjusted his glasses and continued, his words measured and deliberate. Dr. Psychological evaluation documents clear evidence of complex trauma in this child, consistent with emotional manipulation and conditional love dynamics. Sophie exhibits anxiety disorder, signs of a psychological condition where a child is forced to take on emotional responsibilities that belong to adults, and symptoms consistent with what is sometimes called emotional abuse. Made a movement as if to object, but Judge Richardson raised his hand, silencing him before he could speak. I will not be interrupted during this statement, counsel. The judge opened a thick folder before him. Let me read excerpts from doctor's report, because I believe it's important that this record reflects the actual psychological state of this child. Doctor writes, Sophie Martinez exhibits severe anxiety surrounding her relationship with her father, specifically related to perceived conditional love. She has internalized the message that her emotional loyalty to her mother is equivalent to rejecting her father. She has developed hypervigilance regarding her own statements and expressions, constantly monitoring what she says to each parent to avoid disappointing either one. This level of anxiety in an 8-year-old is abnormal and indicative of significant emotional harm. Sophie looked down at her hands, tears already beginning to fall as her father's actions were publicly documented and validated. Leo pressed more firmly against her leg, his presence grounding. Judge Richardson continued, Doctor further notes that during a clinical play therapy session, Sophie spontaneously role-played a scenario in which she was bad for loving her mother. The child had internalized parental conflict as a personal moral failing. This is not normal child development. This is a child who has been psychologically harmed. He shifted focus. The school counselor's testimony indicated that Sophie has experienced multiple panic attacks on school grounds. Her grades dropped from As and to N. She from social interactions with peers. Her physical health declined. She experienced weight loss and sleep disturbances. All of these symptoms occurred specifically during the period when she was undergoing this custody battle and spending time with her father, who was engaging in these manipulative behaviors. Michael's face had begun to crumble. His attorney whispered something urgently to him, but Michael wasn't listening. His eyes remained fixed on his daughter, and the reality of what he had done was beginning to penetrate his consciousness. Judge Richardson's tone remained objective but carried an undercurrent of moral gravity. Now, I want to be absolutely clear about something. I do not believe Michael Martinez is an evil man. I do not believe he deliberately set out to emotionally abuse his daughter. However, intention and impact are not the same thing. The impact of his behavior on this child has been severe and measurable. He consulted his notes. The surveillance recordings from custody exchanges show a pattern. Michael frequently engages Sophie in conversations about adult matters, his own emotional pain, his sense of victimization in the divorce, his anger toward. He asks Sophie questions designed to assess her loyalty and emotional alignment. He creates situations where Sophie must choose between her parents. These behaviors, regardless of intent, constitute emotional manipulation. The judge then addressed, Ms. Martinez, the evidence also indicates that you have prioritized your daughters in ways that Michael has not. You sought professional help for Sophie before being ordered to do so. You attended your own therapy sessions. You attempted to shield Sophie from adult conflict. You created a home environment that is calm, organized, and child-centered. This does not mean you are a perfect parent. No parent is perfect. But your actions overall have been consistent with Sophie's best interests. Was crying openly now, her face buried in tissues, years of stress and fear finally releasing. Judge Richardson then read from the pediatrician's report. Doctor states that Sophie is experiencing physical manifestations of stress and anxiety that are directly correlated with the custody battle and her interactions with her father. The child has been literally made physically ill by the emotional harm occurring in her family. The courtroom was completely silent now, observers riveted by the unfolding drama, journalists scribbling furiously in notebooks, legal scholars mentally cataloging everything they were hearing for later discussion and analysis. Then Judge Richardson addressed something even more profound. The most compelling evidence in this case did not come from expert testimony or surveillance footage or home studies. It came from Leo, the emotional support dog. Leo responded to this child's silent distress signal with protective intervention. An animal, incapable of deception or manipulation, responded to genuine emotional need with immediate, purposeful action. He leaned back in his chair. This animal understood Sophie's truth better than the legal system was equipped to process it. This animal knew, with absolute certainty, that a child was in crisis. And this animal did what every person in this courtroom should have been doing. He prioritized that child's above all other considerations. Judge Richardson's voice grew quieter but more intense. We often talk about justice in legal terms, about procedure, about rights, about evidentiary standards. But true justice, I believe, means protecting vulnerable people from harm. True justice means prioritizing the of a child over the convenience of adults. And true justice means sometimes looking beyond legal procedure to recognize what is actually happening to actual human beings. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Sophie Martinez is suffering. She is suffering because her father, however unintentionally, has emotionally manipulated her. She is suffering because a legal process designed to protect her has, in many ways, made her suffering worse. She is suffering because adults have failed to prioritize her actual. Michael stood abruptly, his face completely broken. His attorney tried to pull him back to his seat, but Michael was already moving towards Sophie. For a moment, the courtroom tensed, uncertain what was about to happen. But Michael didn't approach his daughter with anger or defensiveness. He approached with recognition of his own culpability. Michael knelt down in front of Sophie, his face streaming with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying through the courtroom's complete silence. "Sophie, I'm so sorry. I didn't understand what I was doing. I'm sorry." Sophie looked at her father with an expression of such profound sadness that several observers in the courtroom openly wept. She didn't throw her arms around him. She didn't offer forgiveness. She simply looked at him with the exhausted resignation of a child who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. Judge Richardson allowed the moment to unfold naturally before continuing. "Mr. Martinez, I recommend you work immediately with a trauma-informed therapist. Your daughter needs you to understand what you've done and to commit to changing your behavior. That work begins today." Michael nodded, still kneeling, still crying, finally confronting the reality of his actions. Judge Richardson's voice returned to his judicial tone, but it carried a revolutionary edge. "Based on all evidence presented, my ruling in this matter will be delivered tomorrow morning. But I can tell you now that it will reflect my commitment to protecting this child from further harm." As the courtroom adjourned, Michael remained kneeling in front of his daughter. Sophie reached out and gently touched her father's arm, not a gesture of forgiveness, but a gesture of recognition that he, too, was suffering from what the family's dysfunction had created. Leo remained steady beneath Sophie's other hand, bearing witness to the human drama unfolding around them, understanding in his simple but profound way that healing had begun. The morning of Judge Richardson's ruling arrived with the weight of inevitability. Every seat in the courtroom was occupied, and people stood along the back wall and spilled into the hallway where closed-circuit monitors had been set up to accommodate the overflow crowd. Legal scholars from 3 nearby universities attended. Representatives from child advocacy organizations sat in the gallery. Journalists with notebooks and recording devices positioned themselves strategically. This hearing had transcended the boundaries of a standard custody case. It had become a moment of potential systemic change. Sophie entered the courtroom with her mother and grandmother, Leo at her side. The dog had become such an integral part of the proceedings that his presence now felt essential, almost ceremonial. Michael sat alone on his side of the courtroom, his attorney beside him, looking diminished and deflated. The entire energy had shifted. This was no longer about 2 parents battling over custody rights. This was about a system confronting its own inadequacy. Judge Harold Richardson entered with deliberate solemnity, his demeanor reflecting the gravity of the moment. He settled into his chair and took a long moment, scanning the entire courtroom as if imprinting this moment into his memory. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 30 years of judicial experience and a newly awakened moral conscience. "This case has required me to examine not only the evidence presented, but also my own understanding of what justice means in the context of family law," Judge Richardson began. "I have presided over more than 200 custody cases. I have made decisions affecting more than 400 children, and I have become increasingly aware that our legal system, while designed with good intentions, often fails the very people it is meant to protect." He paused, letting those words settle. Children are the most vulnerable members of society. They have no legal voice. They cannot advocate for themselves. They depend entirely on adults, both their parents and the judicial system, to protect them. When both fail simultaneously, the consequences can be devastating. The judge adjusted his glasses and opened his ruling document. "Based on the comprehensive investigation conducted over the past week, my findings are as follows. Sophie Martinez has experienced significant emotional harm as a result of specific parenting behaviors engaged in by her father, Michael Martinez. This harm is not intentional cruelty, but rather the unintended consequence of behaviors that constitute emotional manipulation, and Sophie's mother, Martinez, has demonstrated a consistent commitment to prioritizing her daughter's emotional and physical." Michael's shoulders collapsed inward, as if physically folding under the weight of the words. Judge Richardson continued, "In matters of custody, the paramount consideration must always be the best interests of the child. Based on all evidence presented, the best interests of Sophie Martinez require that she have the stability, emotional safety, and consistent care that her mother has provided and continues to provide." He paused for emphasis. "Therefore, I am awarding sole legal and physical custody of Sophie Martinez to her mother Martinez, effective immediately." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. This was not surprising given the evidence, but hearing it stated so definitively was nonetheless powerful, began to cry silently, her hands covering her face. Sophie reached over and held her mother's hand. But Judge Richardson was not finished. However, I want to be clear that this ruling is not a rejection of Mr. Martinez as a father. It is a recognition that Mr. Martinez requires support and guidance in understanding the impact of his behaviors on his daughter. Therefore, custody is contingent on the following conditions. The judge consulted his document. Mr. Michael Martinez is required to complete a minimum of 40 hours of trauma-informed parenting education. He is required to participate in individual psychotherapy with a mental health professional specializing in family dynamics, with a minimum of 1 session per week for a period of no less than 1 year. He is required to complete anger management counseling. And he is required to undergo a comprehensive parental evaluation after 6 months to determine his readiness to expand his contact with Sophie. He turned his attention to Michael directly. Mr. Martinez, these requirements are not punitive. They are remedial. They are designed to help you become a better father to your daughter. Your daughter loves you. She does not want to lose her relationship with you. But that relationship must be built on a healthier foundation than currently exists. Michael nodded, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding that the judge was offering him a pathway toward redemption rather than permanent separation from his child. Judge Richardson then addressed something that would reverberate far beyond this single case. I want to make a pronouncement regarding the role of emotional support animals in family law proceedings. What we witnessed in this courtroom demonstrates that animals can serve as authentic witnesses to human emotional truth. Leo, the emotional support dog in this case, responded to genuine distress with protective intervention that transcended the limitations of human legal procedure. He leaned forward, his intensity palpable. Therefore, I am issuing an order that recognizes Leo as a certified emotional support animal with full legal protection and courtroom access. Any attempt to separate Sophie Martinez from Leo during her custodial time shall be considered a violation of this court order and will result in consequences for the party attempting such separation. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. This was unprecedented. No judge had ever issued such a ruling before. Furthermore, Judge Richardson continued, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the commotion, I am recommending that the state judicial system review its policies regarding certified emotional support animals in sensitive family law cases. I believe this case demonstrates that animals can play a meaningful role in protecting vulnerable individuals during legal proceedings. I am recommending that other courts adopt similar policies to allow certified emotional support animals in child custody hearings. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. Let me be clear, this is not about courtroom pets or entertainment. This is about recognizing that sometimes truth is expressed not through words, but through authentic emotional connection. This is about acknowledging that children need every possible source of protection and support during traumatic legal proceedings. Judge Richardson then addressed the broader systemic implications. I also want to state for the record that I believe our adversarial family law system requires significant reform. When we pit parents against each other in legal contests, we often increase trauma for the very children the system is designed to protect. I am recommending that family law courts explore alternative dispute resolution methods, including mediation and collaborative law approaches, that prioritize the child's over parental victory. He looked directly at both and Michael. You are not enemies. You are two people who loved each other once and created a beautiful child together. That child is caught in the crossfire of your adult conflict. I urge you both to work together with mental health professionals to find ways to co-parent that prioritize Sophie's healing rather than either parent's vindication. The judge then made an announcement that would echo through the legal community for years to come. I am recommending that this case be included in judicial training programs nationwide. Judges, attorneys, and mental health professionals need to understand the real impact of custody battles on children. They need to understand what emotional harm looks like, and they need to understand their responsibility to prioritize actual human over legal procedure. Sophie sat perfectly still, absorbing the knowledge that she had finally been heard, that her truth had finally been recognized, that the system had finally chosen to protect her. Leo remained steady beneath her hand, his amber eyes reflecting the courtroom lights, his presence an anchor in a moment of profound change. Judge Richardson's final words were quiet but carried immense significance. "Sophie Martinez, I want to say something directly to you. You are not responsible for your parents' marriage or its dissolution. You are not responsible for this custody battle. You are not responsible for anyone's emotional but your own. You are 8 years old and you deserve to simply be a child. I hope that moving forward you can begin to reclaim that childhood. Leo will help you. Your mother will support you. And this court system will protect you." He banged his gavel, not with anger or finality, but with the deliberation of someone making a declaration about what justice could actually be when focused on human rather than legal victory. As the courtroom erupted in the aftermath of the ruling, Sophie leaned against her mother, Leo pressed against her other side, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that healing was possible. The legal system had failed her initially, but in the end it had chosen her protection. And sometimes that was enough to begin again. Judge Richardson would later reflect on this moment as the most significant ruling of his judicial career, not because of the legal precedents it set, though it would set many, but because for once, the system had truly served the child. 6 months after Judge Richardson's historic ruling, Sophie Martinez had been transformed by the simple act of being allowed to heal. The anxiety that had defined her existence for so long had begun to recede, like an ocean tide pulling back from the shore. She no longer experienced panic attacks at school. She had reconnected with friends she'd isolated from during the custody battle. Her grades had returned to their previous excellence. Most importantly, she smiled, genuine, unguarded smiles that reached her eyes, in a way that suggested childhood was slowly being reclaimed. Leo remained at her side through every phase of this recovery. The dog had become something more than an emotional support animal. He had become a symbol of healing, a living representation of the possibility of survival and growth even after severe trauma. Sophie and Leo were inseparable, and their bond had deepened into something that seemed almost mystical to outside observers. When Sophie had difficult days, Leo knew before she expressed her feelings. When she needed quiet, Leo provided it. When she needed to cry, Leo held her. They had developed a language of comfort that transcended the need for words. Had also begun to heal. The weight she'd been carrying, the guilt, the fear of losing her daughter, the stress of the legal battle, had begun to lift. She'd become more present, more joyful, more able to simply be a mother rather than a warrior in a custody war. She watched her daughter flourish and felt gratitude so profound it sometimes brought her to tears. But Sophie wasn't content to simply reclaim her own childhood. She had begun to think about other children suffering in similar circumstances. She confided in her mother one evening that she wanted to do something. She wasn't sure what exactly, but something that would help children like her, children caught in the machinery of custody battles with no protection except their own resilience. Supported her daughter's instinct. Together, they began researching emotional support animals and custody law. They discovered that Sophie's case was not unique, that thousands of children every year experienced similar trauma during custody disputes. They learned that while Judge Richardson's ruling was revolutionary in their jurisdiction, it had not yet spread to other courts. Most judges still operated within the traditional adversarial framework, still allowed aggressive cross-examinations of children, still prioritized legal procedure over emotional. Sophie made a decision that surprised everyone. She wanted to tell her story publicly. She wanted to create something that would help other children and inform judges, attorneys and parents about the real impact of custody battles on children's mental and physical health. With her mother's guidance and unwavering support, Sophie founded Leo's Voice, a nonprofit organization dedicated to training and placing emotional support animals with children in foster care and custody disputes. The name was deliberate. It acknowledged that Leo's intervention had given Sophie the capacity to speak her truth, and the organization aimed to provide similar voices for other silent children. The organization began modestly, with volunteering her time and working tirelessly on grant applications. But within 3 months, media outlets had picked up Sophie's story. A local news segment about the dog who had stopped a courtroom proceeding went viral. News anchors were moved to tears as they reported on the 8-year-old girl and her golden retriever who had changed a judicial system. Then came the TED Talk invitation. Sophie was terrified. She'd never spoken publicly before. She'd barely spoken during the custody hearing. But Leo would be with her, and that made it possible. On a stage in front of thousands of people, with millions more watching online, Sophie, now 9 years old, told her story. She spoke about the panic attack in the courtroom. She spoke about feeling caught between 2 parents who both loved her but whose love felt conditional, weaponized. She spoke about the moment Leo entered the courtroom and how that simple intervention had changed everything. She spoke about the months of recovery, about learning that she wasn't responsible for her parents' marriage or its dissolution, about reclaiming her right to simply be a child. But more importantly, she spoke about other children. She spoke about the thousands of children experiencing similar trauma. She spoke about the systemic failures that left children without protection during legal proceedings. She spoke about the need for reform, for courts to prioritize children's emotional, for judges to see the humanity in the people appearing before them rather than treating cases as abstract legal problems. The TED Talk was viewed more than 15 million times. Sophie received messages from children around the world who recognized their own experiences in her story. Parents wrote to say that hearing Sophie had prompted them to reconsider their approach to custody disputes. Mental health professionals shared the video in training programs, and judges, actual judges, contacted the organization expressing interest in learning more about alternative approaches to family law proceedings. Judge Richardson became an unexpected advocate for systemic change. He began accepting invitations to speak at judicial conferences about his ruling and its implications. He presented case studies showing how prioritizing children over legal procedure actually improved case outcomes. He advocated for other states to adopt Sophie's Law, as it had come to be known, legislation that would allow certified emotional support animals in sensitive family law cases. 3 states passed Sophie's Law within the first year following Sophie's TED Talk. By the second year, 12 states had adopted similar legislation. Courts began establishing protocols for incorporating emotional support animals into custody proceedings. Mental health professionals were brought into courtrooms as consultants to assess children's needs. The adversarial nature of family law began, slowly, to shift. Leo's Voice grew exponentially. The organization trained dogs and matched them with children in crisis. Sophie became the face of the movement, appearing in documentaries, giving speeches, meeting with legislators. But despite her public prominence, Sophie remained fundamentally herself, a girl who loved reading, who enjoyed art, who wanted to play with friends, who relied on Leo for grounding and comfort. Michael Martinez had taken his path toward redemption seriously. He completed his required therapy and parenting classes. He worked with a trauma-informed therapist who helped him understand the impact of his behaviors on his daughter. He attended Leo's Voice fundraising events. He publicly acknowledged his mistakes and advocated for other parents to seek help rather than weaponize their children in custody disputes. His relationship with Sophie began to rebuild on a healthier foundation. They had supervised visits initially, but as Michael demonstrated genuine change and deeper understanding, those visits gradually became less supervised. He learned to separate his own emotional needs from his relationship with his daughter. He learned to listen to Sophie rather than use her as an emotional support system. He learned that being a good father meant sometimes accepting that was a better parent in certain moments, and that was okay. After 18 months of consistent therapeutic work, Michael and were able to develop a co-parenting arrangement that genuinely prioritized Sophie's. They attended family therapy together. They learned to communicate without conflict. They created a parenting plan that allowed Sophie to have meaningful relationships with both parents while maintaining the stability and emotional safety that's home provided. Sophie began spending alternate weekends with her father, time that was filled with genuine connection rather than emotional manipulation or competition for her loyalty. Michael attended Sophie's school events. He supported her involvement with Leo's Voice. He became a mentor to other divorced fathers learning to navigate co-parenting without harming their children. The most transformative moment came when Michael volunteered with Leo's Voice, helping to raise awareness about the need for parental education in custody disputes. He spoke at community events about his own journey from emotionally manipulative parent to conscious co-parent. His vulnerability and honesty resonated with audiences and helped other parents recognize harmful patterns in their own behavior before causing irreparable damage. 3 years after that courtroom moment when Leo had stopped everything in shock, Sophie was invited to testify before a legislative committee considering expanding emotional support animal access in courts statewide. She arrived with Leo and her mother. She wore a navy blue dress, the same color she'd worn that day when she was 8 years old and couldn't speak. But this time, she was filled with clarity and purpose. Before the legislative committee, Sophie spoke about systemic change. She spoke about the need for judicial reform, for mental health integration in family law, for protection of children's emotional as the paramount consideration in custody disputes. She spoke with the eloquence and conviction of someone who had survived trauma and transformed it into purpose. The legislation passed. It became model legislation adopted by other states. Courthouses began to change. Training programs for judges incorporated Sophie's case. Judicial conferences now included sessions on trauma-informed family law. The system, slowly and imperfectly, began to evolve toward genuine protection of children. But perhaps most importantly, Sophie had learned something fundamental about herself, that her voice, even when silent, had power, that her suffering had meaning, that she could transform her own pain into healing for others, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply surviving and then choosing to help others do the same. Leo remained at her side through it all, a golden retriever with soulful amber eyes and a heart that understood what humans sometimes couldn't express in words. He had been rescued from an abusive home to rescue a child. He had been written off as unadoptable to become the face of a movement. He had changed the judicial system not through legal argument, but through the simple, profound act of loving and protecting someone who desperately needed to be loved and protected. And Sophie, the little girl who couldn't speak in a courtroom, had become a voice for thousands of silent children. She had learned that survival is possible, that healing is real, that sometimes the greatest transformations come from the most broken places, and that sometimes an unexpected rescue becomes the greatest rescue of all.